Welcome, everyone. It's the third session of today's third day, and I'm very proud that we managed to convince Roman Pichler to join us and share his take on product strategy and its criticality for the overall success of your organization and your teams when solving customer problems. And we're really looking forward to learning more from his side. And I would say, Roman, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for the kind introduction. And it's really nice to be here. So common product strategy mistakes and how you can avoid them. So that's the topic I'd like to focus on. Product strategy can sometimes be a somewhat abstract topic, I find. And I thought it might make sense to look at 5 mistakes that I've seen teams make again and again in order so that you can hopefully avoid them. And we can use those mistakes to maybe better understand what an effective strategy is, how we can create and how we can evolve such a strategy, and also who should be involved in this work. So yes, but before I get into, and there's one final thing I wanted to say is I'll try and not use up all the time I have allocated, the 45 minutes, but try and finish a little bit early so we can have a Q&A session at the end. So if you've got any questions, then hopefully there'll be time at the end to discuss them. But before I get into the mistakes, I'd like to briefly explain what I mean by product strategy, what a product strategy is. So a very brief introduction. So in my mind, a product strategy is, you could say, a framework that describes the approach that we've chosen to achieve product success. So essentially to offer a successful, a winning product, a product that creates value, desired value for users, customers, and the business. And so a strategy for me should contain some key pieces of information. And some of these are who the product is for. So who are the beneficiaries, who are the customers and users, and why would people want to use it, the value proposition. The positive impact the product should make on the business, the company, spending money on it. And then those aspects of the product that set it apart from competing offerings, from alternatives. And that's particularly important for commercial revenue-generating products. Now, why, generally speaking, is it helpful to have a product strategy? Well, in my mind, a product strategy really is the foundation for making effective, meaningful, detailed product decisions. Or you could say it's the basis for a focused product discovery and delivery work. So, pressing the wrong button here. So for me, a key benefit is that it does help us discover the right features and the right user experience and select the right technologies and architecture. So to put it very bluntly, how can we create or capture the right user stories if we don't know who the users of the product are? And if we don't understand why they would want to use the product in the first place? So what is the main problem that the product solves for them, or what is the main benefit that it gives them? Equally with the technologies and architecture. I mean, if we don't understand, the context in which the product will be used, how can we then make the right technology-based choices? And then as a second benefit for me is that a strategy allows us to prioritize a product roadmap and prioritize a product backlog. In fact, I find that quite often when teams have challenges with their backlogs and roadmaps, one of the causes is that there's no effective strategy, no effective strategy. And then it gives us the opportunity to say no. I mean, what's the basis for rejecting a stakeholder request if we don't have any strategy, right? So again, for me, the strategy really is the foundation that then guides the discovery and delivery work. Now, having said that, you'd expect that teams and organizations are usually good at practicing product strategy, but my experience suggests that's not necessarily the case. So let's look at those 5 mistakes let's look at them, not only in more detail, but let's look at them. And the first one, as you can see, is that a clear strategy doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not clear at all who the product is for or why people would want to use it, and that's completely unknown. I mean, usually there's a strategy when a product exists. Because, if there aren't any users, any customers, if there's a market for the product, if there isn't a need for the product, no product will be offered on a continued basis, right? But I find that it's not always the case that a strategy has been articulated. So the strategy might be in the head of product, or chief product officer, or VP of product, or director of product management. So the person who runs the product management organization might be in charge of the product strategy, but might not have clearly visualized and articulated, captured the strategy. And then the first step for me is to make the strategy visible so that you can look at it and you can ask yourself if this is the right strategy in order to move the product forward, progress the product, and achieve product success in the future. And there are various ways how you can capture your strategy. The tool I'm using here is the one that I developed many years ago, called the Product Vision Board, which some of you may have seen or may have used. If this tool resonates with you, that's nice. If it doesn't resonate with you, that's equally nice. I'm not trying to persuade you to use a specific tool. I'm just using this one here to show you how you can actually articulate a strategy. Now, this specific template here is called Product Vision Board because it starts with the vision. So the vision is captured at the top, and that's the ultimate purpose for providing a product or the positive change. Generally speaking, you want to create with your product. So an example I like to use is if I wanted to develop an app that helps people improve their eating habits, then the vision of that product might be healthy eating, or slightly more verbose, help people eat more healthily. So I like to work with a vision statement that's comparatively short and sweet, maybe a slogan, and hopefully resonates with everyone involved in working on that product and hopefully making that product successful. And then the strategy itself is captured in the 4 bottom sections. So we've got target group, needs, product, and business goals. Target group are the customers and users, the target customers and users, those people who should benefit from the product, who should use it or pay for it. And part of describing the target group is to state the market or market segment that we want to address. And so to stay with the healthy eating example, I might choose middle-aged men like myself as the target group. People who've developed maybe unhealthy eating habits, maybe they eat too much, maybe they don't eat enough, maybe they eat healthy food, or maybe they drink too much. And then the needs are the reason why people would want to use the product or why people would want to pay for it, the specific problem or problems that the product should address, or the specific benefits it should offer. So in the example, the healthy eating app example, it might be to reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And then the product column gives you the opportunity to state what product it is and what its standout features are, those products that set it apart from competing offerings, from alternatives. And I mentioned this earlier, that's particularly helpful for commercial revenue generating products. And that might be something like, measure and record sugar levels in food. It might be offering personalized eating recommendations, of course, using the latest generative AI technologies, and something like seamlessly integrate with leading smart scales and smartwatches. And the business goals finally state the desired positive impact we want to make on the business benefits that we want to achieve. That might be generating revenue or a certain amount of revenue within, say, the first 12 or 18 months of the launch of the product, or maybe later on in the life cycle of the product, achieving a certain profit margin. But if it was a different type of product, then it might be about reducing cost or increasing productivity, or it might possibly be about developing the brand or increasing brand equity. So what are the tangible benefits that the company wants to get from offering this product? And so, as I said, for me, the first step really, when there is no clear strategy, no articulated strategy, is to make the strategy visible. Literally write it down on a piece of paper or on an electronic canvas using a structure like this one. And then the second step would be that you look over your initial strategy and make sure that it is good enough, that it is specific enough. So I've seen a fair amount of product vision boards over the past 15 years nearly, and quite often the strategies are just a little bit vague, a little bit too coarse-grained, a little bit too unspecific. So, make sure that your target group is so detailed that you can tell if somebody is included or not. Equally with the needs, that the needs are specific enough so you provide sufficient guidance to everyone involved in working on the product, and that you focus on the main need. And if there's more than one need, then prioritize those needs. Similarly with the product, list 3, 4, a maximum of 5 standout features. Don't turn that column or that section into a mini product backlog, something I've seen more than once. Yeah. So what this means is that making strategic decisions means making meaningful choices, and it means saying no to options. It means saying no to ideas. That's part of the whole strategizing work. So be brave, make some decisions, and be specific enough here. And in order to help you with this, I've created a little checklist for the product vision board. So if you download the template from our website, you get the product vision board checklist for free. And again, it guides you through essentially the different sections and wants to help you to get your strategy right, in the sense that it's sufficiently detailed. You've captured it, and it's sufficiently detailed, sufficiently specific. So that was the first mistake in how you can avoid or address it. Capture your strategy. That's the first thing. Now, the next thing that we should do is ask ourselves, how can we tell that the strategy that we've captured is likely to result in a winning product, that it's likely to result in some form of product success? And so, a mistake that I've seen teams make is that their strategies look really nice. They sound really nice, pretty convincing, but they're rather speculative. They're based on someone's experiences, the big boss's opinions and ideas, in the worst case, on wishful thinking, but they're not based on empirical evidence. They're not based on data. So how can we avoid that mistake? And again, how can we maximize the chances that our strategy is effective, that it's likely to help us create this winning product? Well, the approach that I like to suggest is by iterating over the strategy and systematically correcting and refining it, thereby de-risking it, addressing the major risks that it contains. So you start with your initial good enough strategy, but this strategy has to be so detailed and specific that you can actually see the main risks or key risks that it contains and address them. So it has to be testable, and hence I emphasized earlier when I was discussing the first mistake that you should make sure that your product strategy is not too vague, not too high level, but sufficiently specific. Because otherwise, it's just very, very difficult to see and discover any specific risk or assumption. So that's how you start. You look at your strategy and ask yourself, okay, which out of those statements contains uncertainty, and which of those statements or which of the pieces of uncertainty, the risks, have to be addressed now, so we avoid executing the strategy, making the wrong decisions, and taking the product down the wrong path. And based on that risk, I then recommend that you choose the right validation method. That might be to observe target users and customers. It might be to interview, to stay with the example I gave earlier, interview middle-aged men. Or it might be to create a throwaway prototype if it's a technical risk that I want to address, or maybe to do some business modeling if I'm not sure that the underlying business model is helpful in order to meet the desired business goals. And then do the necessary work, collect the relevant data. And once you have the data, evaluate it and decide what to do. And there are typically 3 different choices that you have. The first one is to persevere with your strategy. So that means that by far and large, your strategy seems to be all right. You seem to be on the right track. It seems to be the right approach, but you may have to refine it. You may have to maybe adjust the value proposition, or change a business goal, or adjust a business goal. So that would be the first option. The second option is that actually the approach that you've chosen is shown to be invalid. That's not the right approach. It's unlikely to result in a successful product. And so then you have the option to pivot. And that means to change the strategy significantly. So I could, for instance, instead of offering a healthy eating app, write a book about healthy eating. So I still stay grounded in my vision of helping people eat more healthily. But yeah, the the strategy changes. And then the third option is to kill the innovation initiative. That's advisable if you've already pivoted once or twice, and still, you're struggling to find an effective strategy. Then it may be better to spend time, money, and energy on a different initiative, on a different product, rather than, trying to continue working on this specific one. So the idea is, again, you iterate over your strategy, much like you'd iterate over a product backlog. So, this is really taking agile practices and applying them to strategy work. And by the way, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, I'm not the first person to suggest this. Eric Ries, in fact, to my knowledge, was the first person. And that's, the process that I introduced to you is built on his build, measure, learn process in the context of lean startup. So we're taking agile practices and moving them, you could say, to the front end, to the strategy part, or to the strategy processes, and iterating over our strategy, correcting and refining it until the strategy has been validated and we have empirical evidence that supports each statement within the strategy. So those are the bottom 4 sections on the product vision board if you use that tool. And so, we've shown that there are no desirability risks, feasibility risks, viability, economical viability risks, and ethicality risks in our strategy, which means it's likely to result in a desirable, feasible, economically viable, and ethical product being an offering that doesn't cause any harm for its users, the society in general, and the planet. So, now, hopefully, we have a strategy that has been clearly articulated, and we've validated it, we've refined it, we've corrected it. Now, what could possibly go wrong? Well, I'm not sure how you feel about this. I'm not sure if you ride any bicycles, and if you like fixed gear bicycles. That's what's displayed here. That's a bicycle with a single gear, and in a way, worse, it doesn't have a free hub. So as long as you on the bike and as long as the bike moves, you have to turn the pedals that the cranks are turning too. Now, I've tried fixies and I get why they're used in track cycling. I understand that, but I'm not a big fan of them, at least not using them on the road or even on the trails. It's just really hard work riding uphill, and maybe even harder work riding downhill because, again, you have to keep your legs turning. So for me, fixed bicycles aren't a great idea. And I would suggest the same is true for your product strategy. I know that was quite a wacky analogy, but it allowed me to talk briefly about cycling. Hey, so traditionally, a product strategy or the product strategy work is often seen as something that happens at the beginning of the product lifecycle, where you spend maybe a significant amount of time with the strategy work. And then for the next 3 to 5 years, you execute the strategy. That's it. You're done. Thank God for that. So the strategy is seen as related to a specific stage or a phase. Now, that maybe was helpful 30, 40 years ago for most products. Maybe it is still helpful for some hardware-heavy products that have comparatively long product life cycles and require a high investment. But I think for digital products, that model is no longer relevant. So rather than seeing the strategy as a stage or a phase, I feel it's much more helpful to see it as a workflow or work stream, as an ongoing process. And so for me, it's helpful to think about continuous strategizing and the strategy work as something that needs to happen on a regular or continuous basis. So how can we implement such a process? How can we make that happen? Well, the first thing to do is to allocate time for it. Otherwise, obviously, it won't happen. And in order to not miss any opportunities and not miss any threats, I find it helpful that the person in charge of the product does a little bit of strategy work every single week. Usually half a day is enough. Sometimes less is required. Sometimes a little bit more time is required. So the idea is that you always watch the key factors in order, again, to make sure that you're being proactive, that your strategy is always as up to date as it can be. So it's always a forward-looking set of decisions that shapes the future or helps you shape the future. It's not outdated. In addition to those weekly reviews, that more continuous work, I like to suggest organizing, scheduling bigger quarterly collaborative reviews where you can look at larger trends, at bigger trends, and use a bigger group of people to leverage their expertise and then hopefully make the right strategic decisions for your product. Now, I've started to talk about different factors. Which factors might they be? Well, the first one are the key performance indicators, or I should say the product performance, which is the value that your product creates, using the key performance indicators, the KPIs that are relevant for your product based on your product strategy, and maybe the specific product goals, product outcomes that you want to achieve with your product. So that might be something like monthly recurring revenue, or it might be customer satisfaction score, or it might be daily active users. Again, will very much depend on your product. I've added user interviews here as I find that often product people focus primarily on quantitative data when it comes to assessing how a product is doing. And while quantitative data, I think, can be tremendously valuable, it only gives us a partial picture. And so I think you get a completer understanding and a better, more holistic understanding of how your product is doing when you have the opportunity to speak to selected customers and users. I like to recommend at least once per quarter. And one of the reasons I like to recommend that is so that you can really understand their needs. You can really understand what works for them and what doesn't work, what concerns they have, what ideas they have, so you can empathize with them. So for me, the ability to really develop empathy and empathize with the beneficiaries of your product is crucial to be able to make the right strategic decisions. And I was reading today on LinkedIn a post that claimed that AI is going to make, I don't know what the percentage was of product managers redundant in the coming, I don't think it was like the next 3 years. It was quite an aggressive time frame, if I remember correctly. And one of the reasons stated is because AI is gonna take over now the strategy work. AI is gonna create strategies for us, and I was like, this is amazing. I think, humans sometimes have a hard enough time to empathize with users and customers. I wonder how the machines will cope. And I haven't found an algorithm yet that could empathize with humans, but who knows? Who knows? Anyway, so if you can, I think it's very useful not only to trust your quantitative metrics, but also, as I said, reach out to selected users and customers on a regular basis. And the reason that product performance is so important, I should maybe say that briefly, is if you see negative trends, again, be it monthly recurring revenue, daily active users, be it customer satisfaction, then something is wrong. And that may be an indication that your strategy is no longer valid. So important to look at the product performance. The next factor I like to suggest are trends, consumer, technology, and legal trends. Think about the recent cost of living crises. Think about technology trends like, do I need to mention generative AI again? And legal trends, well, that'll depend on the sector or industry your product is in. Tends to be more relevant for products, say, in healthcare and finance, for instance. But watch out for those trends and see if there's any impact to your strategy. What about changes in the product roadmap and development insights? Has your product roadmap significantly changed? Maybe because the development progress was faster or slower than anticipated. And does that suggest that your strategy needs to be adapted? Sometimes that's the case. So again, something to consider. But what about the competition? Have established players launched new products, or are they offering new features, significantly enhanced features? Have they changed their products in such a way that you should take notice and consider responding to it? Or are new competitors entering your market? So again, are there any threats that you should respond to? And if so, what's the impact on the strategy? And then finally, are there any changes in the product portfolio and business strategy? Because usually they then necessitate a change of the product strategy. And I'll talk a little bit more about portfolio and business strategy and the connection to the product strategy in a second. But just to summarize, again, I'd like to really encourage you to see strategy not as something that is done once in a blue moon, once in a stage or a phase, and then for a significant period of time, the strategy is executed, but rather as a workflow or work stream that essentially runs in parallel to discovery and delivery. The strategy workflow guides the discovery delivery workflow and is informed by any insights from the discovery and delivery work. So that brings me to the penultimate mistake I'd like to discuss with you, and that is that you have your shiny product strategy that has been validated, and you keep updating it. That's cool, but it's not really connected. It's not really connected to other plans. It's not really connected to a product roadmap and the product backlog, but it's not connected to other strategies either in the enterprise. And that'd be a shame because if you don't connect it effectively, then you may not be able to get it right, and you may not be able to use it really to ultimately execute the business strategy, and you may not be able to use it to guide the tactical, detailed, discovery and delivery oriented decisions. So how can we connect the strategy to other important artifacts, or you could say maybe plans? Well, one way to do this is to use another little tool that I've developed called the strategy stack. This is a simplified version. You can find the full-blown version on my blog. But what's important to notice is that we have 5 planning layers here, and the product strategy sits right bang in the middle. So again, just to remind you, product strategy says how will we ensure that the product succeed, that it creates the desired value. How will we bring about some form of product success? Now, what about the connection to the product roadmap? Well, for me, the product roadmap is connected to the product strategy by ensuring that any outcomes. So I like to work with an outcome-based product roadmap, I should say. And some of you might know that I've developed my own outcome-based, goal-oriented roadmap template called the Go product roadmap. But anyway, I think makes a lot of sense to work with outcome-based roadmaps rather than feature-based roadmaps. But I guess that's a different discussion. But so if you use an outcome-based roadmap, which is what I would encourage you to do, then you can in some cases, derive the outcomes, the goals, the product goals on your roadmap directly from the needs and business goals by breaking the needs and business goals in the strategy into sub-goals. But even if that's not the case, then you should ensure that any goals, outcomes on your roadmap help you meet the needs and business goals stated in the product strategy. And that way, the product roadmap implements the product strategy, and that way you get a nice tight connection between those two artifacts. So the product strategy guides the product roadmap, and then you can use the product roadmap to direct the product backlog. How can we do this? Well, by taking the next goal, the next outcome that's on the roadmap and copying it into the product backlog. And then you need to be brave. You need to then remove, or at least that's what I recommend, removing all items in the product backlog that don't help you meet the new goal, and then adding those items that are necessary in order to achieve this goal. And what this means is that the items in your product backlog will then help you execute the strategy. They are indirectly connected to your product strategy. And for me, that's really valuable because it avoids what I like to call a strategy execution chasm, that you have this great strategy, sounds amazing, but the people who built the product ultimately don't really understand it or don't agree with it, don't support it. And they go away and they build what they think is right and implement the features the way they think is most helpful. And so in that sense, then the product strategy will be, pretty wasteful. So yeah, and make sure that your product strategy is actively used to make roadmap decisions, and then, use your roadmap to direct and guide the product backlog. So that way the product strategy is connected to, you could say, discovery delivery. But what about then other plans in the enterprise? What about, say, the business strategy? Well, the business strategy is a artifact that states the approach chosen to help the entire business, the entire company to succeed, and the various ways how you can capture business strategy. Just like with the product strategy, the framework that I like to use is Roger Martin's Playing to Win framework. And for me, any product is a value creating vehicle. It exists to create value for the users and the customers, but also for the business. So ultimately, you want that the product strategy helps you implement or execute the business strategy, and that your products help the business move forward in the right direction. And so you want to make sure that your product strategy is connected to the business strategy, for instance, so that the business goals that you've stated in your product strategy really are aligned with your business strategy. So the business goals in the product strategy are aligned with your business or company strategy. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes when your product is part of a portfolio, it makes sense to have an intermediate strategy here, a product portfolio strategy. I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint here. I'm part of Microsoft 365, formerly known as Microsoft Office. And Microsoft Office is, as you probably know, a productivity tool suite or product family. And if I was in charge of this suite, I would use a portfolio strategy to align the various products, including PowerPoint, Word, Excel, and several others. And so the business strategy in this case would guide the portfolio strategy, and then the portfolio strategy would set the context, be the foundation for making the right strategic decisions for an individual product, say for Word or PowerPoint or Excel. And so the portfolio strategy would then guide the product strategy, or the product strategy would have to help implement, would have to help fulfill the portfolio strategy. So that way you connect your strategies, that way the higher level strategies guide the lower level strategies. And you get that integration, you get that alignment that I think you need to make sure that everybody ultimately is pulling in the same direction. So no matter if this strategy stack resonates with you or not, and if you fully agree with what I had to share or not, make sure that your product strategy, again, is sufficiently connected upwards and downwards, so to speak, that it's not isolated, but that it's informed by ultimately at least the business strategy, and that it guides your product roadmap, but certainly your product backlog. And that brings me to the final mistake, which is about ownership. So I find that it's not uncommon that the head of product owns the product strategy or makes the strategic product decisions. In fact, some of my colleagues recommend exactly that a head of product should do this. Personally, I find in my work that's not necessarily the best possible solution if it becomes a permanent solution. I find it can be much more helpful to empower the product teams, not only to do the product discovery and delivery work, but also to own the product strategy and put the people in charge of the strategy who know most about the product and work on it on a day-to-day basis, essentially. Now, when we talk about product teams, you might first and foremost think of the person in charge of the product manager, a Scrum product owner, and development team representatives like a UX designer, architect, programmer, and maybe a tester. And that product team is great in order to make the relevant discovery and delivery decisions. But I find that this comparatively small product team, I call this the core product team, usually lacks the necessary expertise to get the strategy right. So in order to make the right strategic decisions, what I like to do to recommend is use a bigger or extended product team and integrate the key business stakeholders into this team. So if you are in charge of a commercial revenue generating product, a key business stakeholder would be a marketeer, who then represents the marketing department, a sales rep represents the sales department, and a customer support team member, represents customer support. And so the idea is that you bring the people with the right skills and expertise together, but also people who then have to support the strategic decisions and maybe actively work on the product. So the marketeer may have to create or update the marketing strategy and take care of the marketing collateral, for instance. And then I've added a coach here, as we now have a pretty diverse, pretty cross-functional group of people with possibly some senior stakeholders in there, people who are used to, that their opinion is then acted upon, or their suggestions are implemented. But that's not necessarily the idea here. So one of the mistakes you should avoid is that you try and please everyone and take into account and say yes to everybody's ideas and requests. Then you usually don't end up with a successful product. And the other mistake you should avoid here is that you try and broker a compromise. Successful products are usually not built on big compromises, but as I said earlier, to work with a strategy and get the strategy right means making some tough decisions. So to ensure that there is good collaboration and ensure that there's effective collaborative decision making, it can be very helpful to involve a coach or have a coach, a team coach. And generally speaking, I think we've known this now for decades. When you think of the work of Richard Hackman, for instance, on team and team effectiveness and team performance, that team coaching is a key condition or key success factor for high-performing teams. So having a coach can be very useful. That might be the head of product. It might be a product coach, possibly an internal or external product coach. It might be an agile coach or scrum master. In some cases, it might even be the product manager, scrum product owner. Even so, for me, that's a less preferred solution. So having a qualified coach can be, again, very helpful to facilitate collaboration and help that group, help that extended product team reach some form of agreement. And the benefit for the head of product, by the way, is that the workload of the individual is reduced. So the chances that the individual becomes overworked are reduced as well. And hopefully that also accelerates the decision-making processes. Because now these are the people who are in charge of the strategy and the strategic decisions, and it empowers people, thereby increasing their motivation and hopefully their productivity. So that's what I like to recommend. So those were the 5 mistakes and how you can address them. Just to summarize, make sure that you have a clearly articulated product strategy in place for your product. So if that's not the case, then maybe that's something you want to do. That's where you should start. And then once you've articulated your strategy, make sure that it's valid, that it's backed up by empirical evidence, and that it allows you to move your product forward, progress your product in an effective manner, that implementing that strategy is likely to result in a successful product. Then don't forget to regularly inspect and adapt your strategy and try and establish a continuous strategizing process. Connect the product strategy to other important plans in the enterprise. Make sure that you use your strategy ultimately to decide which items go in the product backlog. So that's connected to discovery and delivery. And then, if you can, try and empower product teams to own the strategies of their products and give the person in charge of the product a final say if no agreement can be reached. I didn't say that on the previous slide when I talked about product teams, extended product teams. But what can happen is when you have this group of people and you try and reach consensus or agreement, that people are locked in arguments, and if despite your best efforts you can't reach agreement, then often it can be helpful to have somebody who can make a decision, at least for now, and that should be the person in charge of the product. So I hope my thoughts were helpful for you. I hope it was a little bit helpful. You can find more about product strategy on my website, but also by reading my book, Strategize. And I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
First of all, thank you so much for this high density approach to product strategy. I think a lot of people will need to think about this. So your templates and further information are highly appreciated. And indeed, there are a few questions. So shall we start? The first one, actually, can product strategy be too restrictive?
Can product strategy be too restrictive? Yes, it can. I think it can be. I think there are two things maybe to consider. One is how detailed and specific the product strategy is. So if you were to make the strategy too detailed, too specific, then you would maybe restrict the decision, the solution and discovery and delivery focused decisions too much. So that's one thing. And the other thing, when it can be felt as being restrictive, is if the people who built the product, the people who work on the tech team, the development teams, if those individuals aren't represented in the strategy work, if they don't participate in the strategy work, if they're not involved in any form. And so, that kind of ties back to the last mistake I addressed, and it goes back to the recommendation of establishing essentially a collaborative strategizing approach where you do involve members of the development or tech teams. So it's usually difficult to involve everyone, but representatives, tends to be okay. At least there's some involvement in that increases the acceptance of the development teams. And again, it avoids that you maybe make the strategy too detailed and too specific.
Hey, question number 2. Is a product strategy required for product success or just highly recommended?
Oh yeah, great question. I think that'll depend who you talk to, but generally speaking, I'd say it's required. I mean, quite honestly, if you think about the basic questions that I encouraged you to explore and answer, in the context of the product vision board, it's like, who are the beneficiaries of an offering? Why would people want to use it? What value, if any, does it create for the organization providing it and spending money on it? And then finally, is it differentiated? Does it stand out from competing offerings in any way? I mean, quite honestly, if you can't answer those basic questions about any offering, any product, any service, I think you're in a poor position then to really make any more detailed decisions about that product and that service. And talk about specific features, pieces of functionality. You talk about the user experience. I think those questions are so fundamental that I think you got to be able to answer them. You got to have meaningful, solid answers to those questions.
Yeah, don't mistake ChatGPT as the norm, right? This is the once in a century lucky situation, let me put it this way. Number 3, how is strategy different from a product plan?
Oh, that's another great question. So thank you for all those questions. So for me, the product plan is the product roadmap, and the strategy is, I mean, I've referred to the strategy as a high level plan. I've recently kind of stepped away from that term a little bit because I find that some people, when they hear the term plan, they think of ultimately something like a Gantt chart based plan simply because of their conditioning, because of their work experience, or something that's pretty detailed and has some timelines and dates on it or specific milestones. And a strategy shouldn't have that. A strategy should be more like a decision-making framework. It should be guardrails that you put in place that allows you then to make more specific decisions. And it should be high level in the sense that it just kind of, how should I put this? It establishes a context or a foundation then for making more specific solution-oriented decisions. So I wouldn't refer to the product strategy as a product plan. It is really that high-level framework. The product plan will be the product roadmap. And with a product roadmap, I'd state specific, my preference would be quarterly product goals or outcomes. I personally would state some timeframes. I mean, everybody states timeframes. Even if you use the now, next, later roadmap, you state some timeframes that are just very big and very vague. But for an internal in-house roadmap, I'd be a little bit more brave and maybe, use quarters as timeframes. And I'd also consider stating metrics and maybe a few selected key capabilities or features that are necessary in order to deliver those goals or outcomes, but the latter is optional in my mind.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Where do you define strategy when you're working on a Scrum model, or when you're working with Scrum?
Yeah, no, and another great question. So, I mean, some of you may know this. I mean, I've got a decent background in Scrum, and I used to work with Scrum teams, and I used to be a Scrum trainer for a number of years. And I had a phase in my career, so to speak, where I was working, with Scrum teams and doing some Scrum work and doing product management work. And so all the models, the frameworks, the approaches and processes I've developed and I teach are compatible with an agile Scrum-based way of working. Now, Scrum is of course a development-centric framework in the sense that it was invented to help teams create complex products. So it only talks about a product backlog. It doesn't recognize a product roadmap. It doesn't recognize a product strategy. It doesn't recognize a business model. It doesn't recognize a whole bunch of artifacts that are necessary, certainly, to effectively manage a product. and I'd say are helpful, for product innovation. But if you follow the strategy stack and if you follow my strategy model where you have your strategy and then that's translated into an outcome-based roadmap, and then you use the outcomes to goals on your product roadmap to direct your backlog, you actually have full compatibility with the current Scrum Guide as far as I understand it. In my mind, fortunately, I think it's a good innovation, a good change, a positive change. The current Scrum Guide introduced the notion of product goals. So those are the outcomes or for me, I look at a product goal as an outcome on the product roadmap. And I like to anticipate product goals not only for, I don't know, the next few months, but for the next 6, 9, or 12 months, if possible. Sometimes it's not possible. And then, you probably don't want to create a product roadmap at all. But so that's where the connection is. So you work with product goals, you have product goals on your roadmap, and the product goals on the roadmap are connected to your needs and business goals in the strategy. And it solves also, sorry, just very briefly, it also solves the challenge that you have in Scrum that you say like, okay, I'd like to work with product goals, but how do I make sure I'm using the right product goals? So in my model, the answer is simple, where it's the right product goal if it helps you execute, if it helps you implement your product strategy.
Absolutely. Roman, that was awesome. What a ride. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and providing all these great artifacts to help us. And thank you for joining us for 3/4 of an hour. So I highly appreciate your service to the community, and hope we can repeat that.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say. Thanks for having me. Hope it was a little bit useful. I know we've covered quite a lot of ground, as Stefan said, but yeah, again, hopefully it was a little bit useful, and good luck with your product strategies.